He was just another face in the crowd, someone people often walked past without a second glance. His hair was messy, his clothes were worn, and his shoes barely held together. He didn't own a house, a car, or even a bed. Every night, he had to find a corner of the city where he could rest his head. Some nights it was under a bridge, some nights in a bus stop, and sometimes he simply sat awake until the morning sun came out. People called him homeless. Too many, that was his entire identity. But inside, he was still a man with feelings, memories, and a heart that refused to turn cold. Life had been harsh, yes. He had lost everything: family, work, and even the comfort of knowing where his next meal would come from. But one thing he had not lost was kindness. Every day, he tried to stay invisible. He didn't want trouble, didn't want to disturb anyone, and surely didn't want pity. He only wanted a little food, a little safety, and maybe a warm smile from a stranger. That was enough to keep him going. But deep down, he often wondered if the world would ever notice him again. One evening, as the clouds grew darker and the wind picked up speed, he walked toward the outskirts of town. He knew rain was coming, and he needed to find a dry spot before it poured. His stomach was empty, but he ignored the pain. For him, hunger had become like background noise, always there, always pressing, but never strong enough to defeat his spirit. Suddenly, the quiet night was broken by the deafening roar of engines, motorcycles, dozens of them. He froze for a moment, watching as a group of bikers rushed past, their headlights slicing through the darkness like fireflies. The ground trembled with their power, and the smell of gasoline hung in the air. Most people feared bikers. Their leather jackets, tattoos, and loud machines gave them an image of danger. To the homeless man, though, they were just people. People who, like him, probably carried their own stories. He stood by the side of the road and watched as they disappeared into the distance. But then, out of nowhere, a sound made his heart race: the sharp screech of metal against gravel, followed by a heavy crash. One of the bikers had lost control. The motorcycle skidded violently before slamming onto the ground. The rider was thrown off, rolling across the wet pavement before lying still. For a moment, the world went silent. The rest of the gang had already gone far ahead, their engines still echoing in the distance. No one saw the accident. No one but him. His first thought was fear. What if the biker's friends came back and blamed him? What if they thought he had caused it? He could already imagine angry men with fists and threats. But then he looked at the biker again. The man on the ground wasn't moving. His arm was twisted awkwardly, his face scratched and bleeding. He looked helpless, vulnerable, just like the homeless man himself had felt so many times before. And in that instant, fear melted away. Without thinking twice, he ran toward the biker. His worn-out shoes slipped on the wet road, but he didn't stop. He dropped to his knees beside the injured man and carefully dragged him away from the motorcycle. Afraid it might catch fire. "Stay with me," he whispered softly. Even though he wasn't sure if the biker could hear him, the man groaned in pain, his breaths uneven and shallow. The homeless man tore off his old jacket, ripping it into strips to use as makeshift bandages. He pressed them against the bleeding wounds, his hands shaking but determined. He had no training, no tools, nothing but the will to help. Minutes felt like hours, but he refused to leave. Rain began to fall, soaking them both, but he stayed there, shielding the injured biker with his own body. Cars passed by at a distance, but none stopped. To the world, they were invisible to men on the side of the road, one broken by accident, the other broken by life. Finally, the biker stirred, opening his eyes halfway. For a moment, he looked confused, as if he couldn't believe who was helping him. A homeless stranger, with nothing to give except compassion, was the one keeping him alive. The homeless man said nothing more. He didn't need thanks. He didn't need recognition. In his heart, helping another soul in need was simply the right thing to do. That night, under the storm, the most unlikely bond was formed, one that neither of them could have predicted. What happened next would not only change the life of the homeless man, but would shock an entire town. That night felt longer than any other. The rain kept pouring, dripping down from the streetlights and pooling into the cracks of the road. The homeless man stayed right there, refusing to leave the injured biker alone. His hands were numb, his body shivered, but his eyes never stopped watching over the stranger he had just saved. When dawn finally crept in, the city began to wake. A faint orange glow painted the horizon, and the sound of morning birds returned. The homeless man blinked against the light, his back aching from sitting on the cold ground all night. Beside him, the biker stirred again, letting out a painful groan. Help finally arrived in the form of flashing red and blue lights. Someone must have called in the accident hours earlier. An ambulance stopped, and paramedics rushed out. They looked surprised to see who was with the injured biker. A man with no shoes worth wearing, hair plastered to his face, and clothes drenched in rain yet holding pressure on wounds as if his own life depended on it. "Step back, sir," one of them said gently. But the homeless man hesitated. He wanted to make sure the biker would be okay. Only when the paramedics nodded and took over did he finally let go. His hands, covered in dried blood, trembled as he stepped aside. The biker was lifted onto a stretcher. For a brief second, their eyes met again. The biker's gaze was weak, but filled with something the homeless man wasn't used to: gratitude. He tried to speak, but the oxygen mask silenced his words. The homeless man simply nodded, as if to say, "Don't worry, you're safe now." The ambulance roared away, leaving him behind in the empty street. No one asked his name. No one offered him a ride or a meal. Just like always, he faded back into the shadows of the city. But something inside him felt different this time. For once, he didn't feel invisible. Later that morning, as he walked toward the town center, people still avoided him. Some crossed the street, others looked down at their phones. To them, he was just another homeless man. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know that only hours ago, he had saved someone's life. Meanwhile, in a quiet hospital room, the biker regained full consciousness. He was no ordinary rider. He was the leader of a large biker brotherhood, feared, respected, and followed by hundreds. He had faced countless challenges, but lying in that bed, hooked to machines, he felt a different kind of weakness. The memory of the night before replayed in his mind. The crash, the pain, the cold rain, and then hands that were rough, calloused, yet gentle enough to stop the bleeding. It wasn't one of his brothers who had saved him. It wasn't a doctor or a passerby. It was someone the world ignored. The biker couldn't let it go. He asked the nurse about the man who stayed with him. No one had taken a name. No one had cared to ask. That bothered him. By afternoon, word had spread quietly through the biker community. Their leader was alive, but not because of luck. Because of a stranger. A homeless man with nothing in his pockets, yet a heart richer than most. The gang gathered at the hospital, their boots echoing through the hallways, leather vests creaking as they walked. People stepped aside, nervous of their presence. They looked tough, even intimidating. But behind their hardened expressions was something else: a fire of loyalty and a burning question. Who saved our brother? The leader told them everything. How the man had stayed all night. How he had torn his own jacket to make bandages. How he hadn't asked for anything in return. The gang listened in silence, exchanging glances. This was not something they expected to hear. For men who lived by codes of loyalty and respect, this story hit them deeply. They believed in debts, in paying back what was owed. And now, they owed more than money. They owed their leader's life. That very evening, engines thundered once again. Not one, not 10, but hundreds. Nearly 300 bikers rolled into the city together, their roar shaking the ground. People peeked from windows, unsure if trouble was coming. But this time, the gang wasn't here to cause fear. They were here for one man. The man everyone else overlooked. The man who had given everything when he had nothing. The homeless man, unaware of what was about to unfold, sat by an alley, nibbling on a piece of bread someone had left behind. His world was about to change forever. The sound reached him before the sight. A low, rumbling thunder that seemed to roll across the ground itself. At first, the homeless man thought it was another storm coming. But then it grew louder, deeper, until the walls around him seemed to vibrate. He lifted his head, squinting against the sun, and what he saw made his heart skip. Motorcycles. Dozens upon dozens of them. Their headlights lined up like a river of fire, their engines growling like a living beast. The noise was so powerful that people in the streets stopped what they were doing. Store owners stepped outside, children pointed in awe, and drivers pulled over just to let the sea of bikes pass. And they weren't scattered. They moved together, side by side, like soldiers in formation. 300 strong, leather jackets, patches shining, faces that looked carved from stone. It was not just a ride, it was a statement that the homeless man's first instinct was fear. He pulled himself into the corner of the alley, clutching the half-eaten bread in his hand as if it could protect him. His mind raced back to the accident. What if they think I hurt their leader? What if they came for revenge? He had seen enough movies and street fights to know how these things could turn ugly. The engines slowed, and then, all at once, they stopped. The silence that followed was even heavier than the roar before it. 300 bikes standing still. 300 men staring in the same direction. And that direction was him. He froze. His heart thumped so hard it felt like it might break through his chest. For a moment, he wanted to run. But where could he go? His legs wouldn't move anyway. From the center of the pack, one bike rolled forward. On it sat the leader, the very same man he had pulled from the road just one night before. His arm was wrapped in bandages, his face still carrying fresh scars. But his eyes were steady, clear, and locked onto the man who had saved him. The leader stopped his bike just a few feet away. He stepped off, boots hitting the pavement with a heavy thud. He didn't speak right away. He just stood there, staring at the homeless man. The gang behind him stayed silent too. For a city used to noise, the stillness felt almost unreal. Finally, the leader broke the silence. His voice was deep, rough, but steady. "You saved my life." The homeless man didn't answer. He didn't know what to say. His throat was dry, his body tense. The leader took another step closer. "Last night, when I hit the ground, nobody was there. Nobody but you. You could have walked away, but you didn't." The homeless man swallowed hard. I just did what I could." His voice cracked, quiet but honest. The leader nodded slowly, then looked over his shoulder at the army of bikers waiting behind him. He raised a hand, and in perfect unity, all 300 men removed their helmets. Faces revealed, eyes locked on one man. "This is the one," the leader said, his voice echoing. "This is the man who gave me another day." Murmurs rolled through the crowd. Not anger, not suspicion, respect, deep, undeniable respect. These men, hardened by roads and battles of their own, understood the weight of sacrifice. They saw before them not a homeless man, not a beggar, but a brother in spirit. The homeless man felt his chest tighten. For years, he had been ignored, overlooked, brushed aside like dust on the sidewalk. And now, 300 strong were looking at him as if he mattered more than anyone in the world. The leader walked closer and extended a hand. His palm was scarred, his fingers rough, but the gesture was clear, an offering not just of gratitude, but of honor. The homeless man hesitated, staring at that hand. He wasn't used to being touched, let alone respected. But slowly, almost nervously, he reached out. Their hands met. A strong grip sealed an unspoken bond. The leader's voice dropped low but carried the weight of a promise. "You won't be forgotten, not now, not ever." And with that, the story of one homeless man and 300 bikers had only just begun. The homeless man stood frozen, his hands still locked in the biker leader's grip. Around him, 300 bikers waited in silence, their presence filling the entire street. To the world, it must have looked like a showdown. But for the man in torn shoes and a weary face, it felt like standing at the edge of a miracle he couldn't yet understand. The leader finally let go of his hand, but didn't step back. He looked at him with eyes that carried both strength and sincerity. "You gave me more than a chance to breathe again," he said. "You gave me a reason to believe people like you still exist." The homeless man lowered his gaze, almost embarrassed. He wasn't used to being noticed, let alone praised. "I didn't do much," he muttered softly. "Anyone would have helped." The leader shook his head. "No, not anyone. People passed by. They always pass by. But you didn't." Those words hit hard. The homeless man felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. Value. For so long, he had been treated like nothing more than background noise in the busy city. But now, this man, a leader of hundreds, spoke to him as if he mattered. The leader turned to his brothers and raised his voice so everyone could hear. This man has no home, no comfort, and yet, when it mattered most, he gave everything he had. If the world turned its back on him, then today we turn it back around. The crowd erupted, not with noise, not with anger, but with unity. 300 heads nodded, 300 men ready to act. The homeless man blinked in disbelief. I don't understand, he whispered. The leader placed a hand on his shoulder. You will follow us. Before he could argue, the engines roared back to life. The leader gestured for him to climb onto the back of his motorcycle. The homeless man hesitated, his eyes darting between the sea of bikes and the leader's patient stare. Finally, with trembling hands, he climbed on. For the first time in his life, he felt the raw power of the road beneath him. The convoy moved. A thunderous wave of engines rolled through the city streets. People lined the sidewalks, cameras raised, whispers spreading like wildfire. What's happening? Who is that man? Nobody knew the truth, but everyone could feel that something extraordinary was unfolding. They drove beyond the tall buildings, past the edge of the city, until the roads became narrower and the air quieter. Finally, the convoy pulled into a small, empty lot on the outskirts. The leader stopped his bike and helped the homeless man off. The lot was quiet, surrounded by trees, the kind of place where silence carried its own weight. The homeless man looked around, confused. Why are we here? The leader turned to him with a steady gaze. This is where your life begins again. The homeless man frowned, not understanding. But before he could speak, trucks began arriving, flatbeds loaded with lumber, bricks, cement, and tools. More bikers came, not just to ride but carrying supplies, hammers, and ladders. The homeless man's mouth fell open. What is all this? The leader smiled faintly. Your home. The words didn't register at first. He thought maybe he misheard. But then he saw it, dozens of bikers unloading wood, laying foundations, hammering nails. Leather jackets traded for work gloves, engines replaced by the sound of saws and hammers. 300 strong, building something from the ground up. His chest tightened, his eyes stung. He stepped back, shaking his head. No, this can't be for me. I don't deserve this. The leader walked closer, his voice calm but firm. Brother, you gave me life. This is us giving it back. Don't fight it. Accept it. The homeless man tried to speak, but his voice broke. His whole body trembled with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. For years, he had lived invisible. For years, he had convinced himself he was beyond saving. And yet, here they were, men who were feared by many, men who looked rough and untouchable, laying bricks for him. The day stretched on. The homeless man watched in awe as the bikers worked together like a family. Some hammered nails, others painted. A few cooked food over open grills to keep the workers fed. There was laughter, music, and a sense of brotherhood in the air. Children from nearby neighborhoods came to watch, their eyes wide as they saw the feared biker gang transform into builders of hope. The homeless man couldn't stand still. He wanted to help. He grabbed a hammer, his hands clumsy but eager. A few bikers chuckled, but not in a cruel way. One of them guided him, showing him how to hold it properly. Together, they worked. For the first time in years, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. As the sun began to set, the outline of a small but sturdy house stood proudly where the empty lot had been that morning. Walls rose, windows framed, and a roof half completed. It wasn't finished, but it was real. More real than any dream he had dared to hold onto. He stepped back, his eyes wet, his lips trembling. The leader came to stand beside him, crossing his arms proudly. It's not much yet, he said, but tomorrow it'll be a home. Your home. The homeless man couldn't hold it in any longer. Tears spilled down his cheeks, rolling freely as he whispered, Nobody's ever done something like this for me. The leader placed a heavy hand on his shoulder once more. Get used to it. You're one of us now. And in that moment, surrounded by men society feared, the homeless man realized he wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't forgotten. He had a family. For the first time in years, he had a future. The sun rose the next morning with a golden glow that seemed to carry a different kind of energy. The lot, once empty and forgotten, was alive with motion and noise. The thunder of motorcycles was replaced by the rhythm of hammers, the buzz of saws, and the laughter of men who had turned the impossible into reality. The homeless man who for years had lived with no name, no place, no recognition woke to the smell of food cooking on open grills. He rubbed his eyes, half believing he was still dreaming. Around him, bikers were already at work. Some mixed cement, some lifted wooden frames, others shouted directions to keep the flow moving. It was like watching an orchestra, but instead of instruments, they held tools. He tried to stand quietly to the side, still not convinced he deserved any of it. But one of the bikers tossed him a hammer and called out, "Don't just stand there, brother. This is your house too. You've got to leave your mark on it." His first swing was awkward, the nail bending under the pressure. The bikers around him laughed, not with cruelty, but in good humor. One stepped forward, guiding his hands. "Like this," he said, showing him the right way to strike. The homeless man tried again. This time, the nail went in straight. Cheers erupted around him, as if he had just scored a victory. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of pride. Word of what was happening spread quickly through the town. At first, people came out of curiosity. Parents brought their children to watch the gang everyone had once feared. Neighbors peeked from windows, unable to believe their eyes. 300 bikers, the same men who were often seen as troublemakers, were working with unity and discipline to build a house for a man most had ignored. The scene was powerful. Some onlookers whispered in disbelief, "Is this real?" Others felt their hearts stir with emotions they couldn't quite explain. It was as if kindness had exploded in the most unexpected place that by afternoon. The crowd had grown larger. People from the community began stepping forward to help. A man from the hardware store brought extra supplies. A local bakery sent boxes of bread and pastries. Even a group of teenagers offered to paint the fence once it was finished. The homeless man stood in the middle of it all, his eyes wide, his chest tight. For years, he had eaten scraps, slept in shadows, and felt invisible. Now, children were handing him water bottles. Women were offering him food, and men were patting his back as though he had always belonged. He found himself smiling a real smile he hadn't felt in so long that it almost hurt his cheeks. The bikers noticed it too. One of them clapped him on the shoulder and said, "See, that's the man you've always been. Not forgotten, not invisible, just waiting to be seen." The day went on with energy that never seemed to fade. The frame of the house grew taller, the roof took shape, and walls began to close in. Each nail driven into the wood carried more than construction, it carried dignity, respect, and love. As the sun began to dip, painting the sky with orange and purple, the bikers gathered in front of the nearly completed home. It wasn't finished yet, but it stood strong, proud, and real. The leader stepped forward, his bandages still fresh but his voice firm. He looked at the homeless man and said, "Last night, you stood alone in the rain for me. Today, none of us will let you stand alone again." The homeless man's throat tightened. He wanted to speak, to thank them, but words refused to form. His eyes filled instead, tears sliding down a face that had long forgotten what it felt like to cry for happiness. He covered his mouth with his hands, trying to contain the emotion, but it poured out anyway. The crowd clapped, cheered, some even wept quietly at the sight. It wasn't just about a house. It wasn't just about bikers. It was about humanity, about what happens when people choose to see each other as human beings, instead of labels. That night, as the bikers prepared to rest and return the next day, the homeless man sat by the wooden frame of his new home. He ran his fingers across the fresh wood, inhaling the smell of sawdust and paint. It was more than a house. It was proof that he mattered, that kindness had not left the world, and that even a man with nothing could spark a chain reaction that changed everything. Above him, the stars began to shine. For the first time in years, he didn't look at them with despair. He looked at them with hope. The house wasn't done, but something else already was: his loneliness. The third morning came with a clear sky, the kind of bright blue that feels like a promise. By now, the lot was no longer a construction site, it was a gathering place. Bikers lined up early, engines rumbling not for intimidation, but for celebration. Trucks arrived with paint, furniture, and even flowers. It was no longer just about wood and nails. It was about giving back dignity to a man who had lost it all. The homeless man sat on a bench someone had dragged over, watching as the chaos of teamwork unfolded in front of him. He was still overwhelmed, still struggling to believe that this wasn't just some strange dream. Every time he tried to offer more help, the bikers would laugh and tell him, "Relax, brother. This is your day." But he didn't want to just stand aside anymore. He wanted his hands to be a part of the story. So he picked up a brush. With a group of teenagers, he helped paint the walls a soft cream color, each stroke steady and careful. The laughter of the kids reminded him of a time long ago, when life was simpler, when he still believed tomorrow would bring good things. For a moment, he felt like he had traveled back there. By noon, the house had a roof, walls, and windows that gleamed in the sun. Inside, bikers carried in furniture, beds, a table, even a bookshelf filled with donated books. Someone rolled in a rug. Another man placed a lamp by the window. These weren't just objects. They were symbols of comfort, of belonging, of life. The homeless man stepped inside for the first time, his footsteps soft on the wooden floor. He looked around in silence. His throat tightened. The smell of fresh paint, the sunlight streaming through the window, it all felt unreal. For years, he had woken up to concrete walls, cold sidewalks, and the sound of traffic. Now, he was standing in a place built just for him. He ran his hand along the wall. It was smooth, new, alive. His fingers trembled as if he were touching something holy. His voice cracked as he whispered to himself, I have a home, outside." The bikers gathered again, waiting for the leader to speak. When the man stepped out of the doorway, blinking against the sunlight, the leader raised a set of keys high in the air. The crowd cheered, engines revved in unison, the sound rolling like thunder through the town. The leader walked forward and placed the keys in his hand. His voice was steady but warm. "You gave me my life back. Today, we give you yours." The homeless man's knees went weak. He clutched the keys tightly, holding them as if they might disappear. Tears welled in his eyes, and this time, he didn't hold them back. They streamed down his cheeks freely. The bikers clapped him on the back, hugged him, shouted words of encouragement. The crowd of neighbors, who had gathered again to witness the final moment, broke into applause. Some even cried. They had seen this man walk their streets, hungry and forgotten, and now they were watching him rise, lifted by the very people they once feared. Children ran up to him, tugging his sleeve, asking if they could come see his new home. He laughed through his tears and nodded, leading them inside, showing them the rooms as if he had been waiting his whole life to give a tour. As evening approached, the bikers lit a fire in the yard. They grilled food, passed around bread and drinks, and filled the air with laughter. It wasn't just a construction project anymore. It had turned into a celebration of kindness, loyalty, and second chances. The homeless man sat by the fire, the keys still in his hand, staring at the home that now stood tall behind him. He thought about all the nights he had spent under bridges, all the mornings he had woken up cold and alone. And now this, a house filled with warmth, built not just by hands but by hearts. The leader sat beside him quietly. For a while, they didn't speak. They simply watched the fire crackle, listened to the voices of men who had become brothers. Then the leader said softly, "You see, family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up when no one else does." The homeless man nodded, his eyes glistening. "And you showed up for me." The leader shook his head. "No, brother. You showed up first. You taught us all what real loyalty looks like." The fire burned brighter, and above them, the stars spread across the sky. But for the homeless man, it wasn't the stars that mattered anymore. It was the fact that tomorrow, for the first time in years, he would wake up not to the cold pavement, but to a bed. Not in a corner where he hid from the world, but in a home where the world had finally said you belong. That night, as the bikers prepared to leave one by one, they promised to return. And he knew they would, because this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. The night after the house was finished was different from any night he had ever lived before. For the first time in years, the homeless man no longer homeless lay down on a real bed. The mattress was soft, the blanket warm, and the silence of the room felt almost too perfect to be real. He ran his hands across the sheets again and again, just to remind himself this wasn't a dream. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of crickets outside, and felt tears slip quietly down his cheeks. They weren't tears of sadness this time. They were tears of peace. He whispered into the darkness, "Thank you," not knowing if he was speaking to the bikers, to fate, or to life itself. The next morning, he stepped outside, expecting the lot to be empty again. But it wasn't. A line of motorcycles gleamed in the sunlight. True to their word, the bikers had come back not because they had more work to do, but because they wanted to make sure he never felt alone again. One by one, they greeted him with smiles, pats on the back, and words that lifted his spirit. "How'd you sleep, brother?" one asked. Another grinned and said, "You look 10 years younger already." Laughter filled the air, and for the first time in his life, he realized he had a family not by blood, but by choice. As the days passed, the house became more than a building. It became a gathering place. Children came by after school to hear stories. Neighbors who once walked past him without looking now stopped to chat, to bring food, or to sit on the porch with him. People who had once been strangers now spoke to him with respect. The bikers kept visiting too. Sometimes just a few, sometimes dozens. They would park their motorcycles outside, share meals, play music, and sit around the fire they had built. The homeless man, no longer invisible, sat among them, his voice joining in their laughter. His presence no longer an afterthought. The leader of the bikers would often sit beside him in quiet moments. They didn't need many words. Sometimes they simply watched the sunset together. Other times, the leader reminded him, "You saved me when no one else would. That makes you one of us forever." One evening, weeks later, the community gathered again in front of his home. It was not planned, but people came anyway, neighbors, children, and of course, bikers. They brought food, music, and stories. It turned into a celebration of something bigger than one man or one gang. It was a celebration of kindness, loyalty, and the power of doing good when no one else will. The man stood on his porch, looking at the crowd. His eyes scanned the faces, smiling, hopeful, united, and he felt his voice rise from somewhere deep within him. "I used to think I was invisible," he said softly. "I thought the world had forgotten me. But that night, when I chose to help, I realized something. Sometimes, the smallest act can light a fire big enough to change everything." The crowd listened in silence, the flickering glow of the fire lighting their faces. "You gave me a home," he continued, his voice breaking slightly. "But more than that, you gave me a reason to believe again. If a man with nothing can give something, then maybe none of us are truly empty." Applause broke out. Some cheered, some wiped tears. The bikers revved their engines in unison, the sound echoing like thunder under the stars. That night, he didn't just feel like a man with a new home. He felt like a man with a new identity. No longer the homeless man, no longer forgotten. He was a brother, a friend, and a living reminder of what kindness can create. From that day forward, whenever people passed by the little house on the edge of town, they didn't see just a house. They saw a story of a man who had nothing but gave everything, and of 300 bikers who showed the world that even those feared by many can carry the greatest compassion. And every evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, the man would sit on his porch with a gentle smile, watching life unfold before him. Not invisible, not forgotten, but finally seen. Because sometimes, the most powerful stories aren't written in books or shouted in headlines. Sometimes they are written quietly in the hands that pull a stranger from the road, and in the hearts that gather to build a home.